Chapter 22 of the Tale of Grandfather Mole. Read for LibriVox.org. The Tale of Grandfather Mole by Arthur Scott Bailey. Chapter 22. Two Famous Diggers. Billy Woodchuck had decided to move into new quarters before cold weather set in. Old dog Spot had learned where he lived, and to Billy's dismay Spot was spending altogether too much of his time watching Billy's front door. There was only one reason why Billy Woodchuck didn't exactly care to dig a new home for himself in the pasture just then. The fall crop of clover was about to head out, and being very fond of clover blossoms, Billy hated to spend his time digging. He was telling his troubles one day to old Mr. Crow, and as usual Mr. Crow had an idea. "Why don't you get somebody to help you?" he asked. Billy Woodchuck looked a bit doubtful. "Who is there?" he inquired. "Nobody would be willing to dig for me unless I paid him." "Well, if I were you, I'd offer a modest wage," Mr. Crow suggested. But Billy Woodchuck shook his head. "I couldn't pay anybody anything, unless it was clover tops," he explained. "And why should anyone dig for them when there are thousands to be had for the taking?" Mr. Crow agreed that Billy Woodchuck knew what he was talking about. "But," said Mr. Crow, "I've usually found that there's a way out of every difficulty. What you must do is to find somebody that likes to dig, somebody that is so crazy to dig that he'd help you just for the fun of the thing." Billy Woodchuck looked still more doubtful. "Who is there?" he asked once more. Meanwhile Mr. Crow had been thinking rapidly, for he was a quick-witted old scamp. "I'll tell you!" he cried. "There's Grandfather Mole." Although Billy Woodchuck brightened considerably, for Mr. Crow's ideas made him more hopeful, he observed that he didn't know Grandfather Mole. "I've heard of him, however," Billy told Mr. Crow. "He lives in Farmer Green's garden. But you know I never go there. I stick to the fields. I don't like to get too far from home." "For once, then," said old Mr. Crow, "I should break my rule if I were you, and visit the garden. Find Grandfather Mole and have a talk with him." So Billy Woodchuck decided that he would take Mr. Crow's advice. And though he hated to leave the clover patch, he set out that very afternoon to find Grandfather Mole and ask him if he wouldn't like to help dig a winter home in the pasture. But before starting on his journey, Billy Woodchuck waited until Mr. Crow came back and told him that Grandfather Mole had just appeared above ground. Billy Woodchuck hurried off across the pasture as fast as he could scamper, and in a short time he reached Farmer Green's garden. He was somewhat out of breath, because there had been plenty of good things to eat all summer long, and he was round as a ball of butter. Luckily he arrived just in time. Grandfather Mole had been on the point of creeping down into one of his many underground halls when he heard a strange voice say, "Stop a moment, please. I've something important to say to you." It was a pleasant voice. If it hadn't been, Grandfather Mole wouldn't have waited an instant. He turned his head toward the place where the voice came from and said, "What is it, stranger? And talk fast, because I'm busy. I have some digging to do down below." End of Chapter 22.